The New York Mets will be without Sean Manaea on opening day as he is dealing with an oblique injury. Do they really have enough depth to overcome another hit to their starting rotation? I'll talk about that more on today's show.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Now, the Mets got a bunch of bad injured news today. We'll talk about Manaea in a minute, but first and foremost, Nick Madrigal is out for a while. We already knew that he went down with a dislocated shoulder. They got an MRI, and they found out there's actually a fracture in his left shoulder. And so he's already been moved to the 60-day IL. I just would not count on Madrigal having any impact on the Mets this season. By the time that he might be good to go, you would hope that the youth has taken over that utility infielder spot, or maybe there is an OMG Jose Iglesias reunion, although as I talked about on yesterday's show, I still don't believe that's likely. Still think the Mets want to leave that position open for their young players to have opportunities in the big leagues, and they have three guys that need those chances in Beatty, Acuna, and Mauricio. So at this point, I think this just means no Nick Madrigal, and that's unfortunate for him, but should not impact the Mets too significantly. The injury that will impact the Mets, at least at the start of the season, is Sean Manaea going down with an oblique strain. Now, this is an injury he was dealing with apparently all camp, felt it as soon as he started throwing, didn't think much of it. It was minor, but it wasn't getting any better. He described it as sort of plateauing where it just was still lingering and it wasn't going anywhere. So the Mets decided to get it checked out. An MRI showed an oblique strain. They're saying it's not a serious one where it gets into the rib cage and it's one that could potentially require a PRP injection or something of that note. This is simply just a rest and recover situation where doctor's orders are stop throwing. Carlos Mendoza said it could take 7 days, 14, 21 days. They just have to let that injury sort of heal itself and let that muscle calm down. Once everything is back to normal, they will get him throwing again. But because of the timing of this injury, already a couple weeks into camp, and the fact that he won't throw for a couple weeks and then ramps it up again, the Mets have already ruled him out for opening day. So Sean Manaea will start the season on the IL. It could be a short stint. He could be back in the middle of April, and the Mets can sort of hit the ground running from there, or it could be longer than that. And so now you're looking at a starting rotation that already lost Frankie Montas for probably multiple months. I think best case scenario for Montas is we see him at some point in May. Now you lose Sean Manaea too. So this starting rotation right now, it has Kodai Senga at the top of it, which you can feel good about because all the early returns at camp have been positive, but he's still a red flag simply because he didn't pitch last year. And he does have some injuries in his past when he was pitching in Japan too. So you can't look at Kodai Senga as, oh yeah, we're not worried about it. It was just a 1-year thing. He's completely healthy. For now he is, but you just never know. So you have to be a little bit cautious there. Clay Holmes, everything looks great. He seems to be taking the transition to being a starting pitcher extremely well. He's still transitioning to be a starting pitcher for the first time in a long time. David Peterson, all good for him, but still you never really know in camp. So those are the three guys that you can write it in pen. But there's now a competition that was originally three guys vying for a 6th starter spot, which might not have even been necessary at the beginning of the season. When Montas went down, there was some talk of, all right, the Mets, they might go with the 6-man rotation where the guys that would be in the 5th and the 6th spot of the rotation would piggyback in one spot until the Mets needed 6 starters. Now, all of a sudden, those three guys that were competing for maybe one spot, maybe 2 spots, all of a sudden, it's definitely 2 spots. Potentially, all 3 of them could be part of the rotation if the Mets go with the 6-man rotation from jump. It doesn't feel like they will. I think this is probably more 3 guys competing for 2 spots. And who knows? If Tylor Megill outright wins a job right now, maybe they will look at the less of the two between Canning and Blackburn and decide to put one of them in the bullpen. maybe they'll still piggyback that fifth starter spot. Whoever's throwing the ball better will stay in the rotation. And the hope might be when you get to a point where Sean Manaea is healthy, that might be around the same time that you'd go to a six-man rotation anyway, and you can figure everything out from there. But this now puts the Mets in a position where they went into camp with 8 viable starting pitchers once they decided to move Jose Budo into the bullpen. And now they're down to 6. And it can happen so quickly that you have to wonder, are the Mets really comfortable trusting their depth? They said publicly that's what they're doing. This is why you have as much depth going into camp. And they have a couple other guys we'll talk about in the next segment that are on, the bottom of their 40-man roster, non-roster invites that maybe they like. And there's top pitching prospects. But really, the Mets were going into this year hoping that some combination of those 8 starters would get them through a majority of this season until those prospects were ready. Now, you are a Kodai Senga injury away from being in a real hurt at the beginning of the season, and you're already kind of there. So that leads us to wonder, is Jose Quintana coming back to the Mets? The Mets are saying no publicly, but if they were negotiating with him behind the scenes, would they really come out and say, yeah, you know what? Now that Quintana's out, now that Manaea is out, we got Quintana on the phone and we're just ironing out the details. The contract's going to be signed. He's going to be reporting to camp tomorrow. I don't think it would have been that public of a stance from day one of this injury news. So I wouldn't rule it out entirely. And it is interesting to note that there has been some reports that Jose Quintana has been scratched from the roster for the World Baseball Classic for Colombia because he has signed a deal. Now, is that deal with the Mets? Is that deal with another team? Is that even an accurate report that's out there? We're going to have to wait and see. But that is still something that is potentially in the works. If it is, I feel so much better about this rotation because you know what? Before the injuries, when the Mets were going into camp with Megill, Blackburn, and Canning competing for that 6-starter spot, I was saying I still think they should sign Quintana since he's out there. Now they've lost Montas for months. They've lost Manaea potentially for hopefully just weeks, but you never know. An oblique could linger. We'll see what happens. Now it just makes so much sense to do it, but we'll see. If the Mets really believe that Manaea is going to be fine by the middle of April, then why would they react to this? Is, I guess, sort of playing both sides of the argument here. But let's just say that Quintana has signed a deal with the Brewers, and he's going to go there. He's going to go pitch in Milwaukee. Well, now he's off the table. So what would be left if the Mets are relying on their depth and then something else happens? I want to talk about that in just a minute. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. If you're an everyday listener to the show, make sure to become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service where you get updates from me anytime news breaks from the Mets, like today. When the Manaea news came out, the first thing I did was send a text message out to the insiders, and then I went back and forth with a lot of you just talking about the injury and giving you my early takes and reads on the situation. So if you want to be part of our texting service, find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. So should the Mets' depth be trusted? Right now, if all stands and they decide that Jose Quintana is not worth an investment and Quintana signs with another team, they're going to be really relying heavily on Paul Blackburn, Griffin Canning, and potentially Tylor Megill to start the season because Tylor Megill is absolutely inevitable, as I talked about before camp started. I don't see how Megill ends up breaking camp with the Mets because he's got an option. Now here we are. There's still a world where he doesn't, where the Mets decide we're going to go with a 5-man rotation and stock our bullpen up and put Megill in Syracuse. But I almost feel like that's only the outcome that happens if Megill has a bad camp, because if he pitches anywhere close to what he did what he looked like last year, I feel like he's got to be part of this opening day rotation now. And I like Megill more than Canning and Blackburn, if I'm being completely honest. If it wasn't for the roster constraints put on the other two, I would have said Megill should be the favorite to beat these guys out for a job because I think he has the best stuff of the three. I don't think Paul Blackburn and Griffin Canning have good stuff necessarily. Tylor Megill struck out 27% of the batters he faced last year. He had a 4.4 ERA, which is a lot better than you might remember it being. And his fielding independent pitching was 3.55. This is a guy that continued to tinker with his arsenal. I think now he is working in a kick change. Last year there was a splitter. We'll see if he's going to use both of those pitches as the similar off-speed offerings there. But we know that he can sit in the mid to high 90s when he wants to with that fastball. He implemented that two-seamer last year that really worked for him. I actually have some hope here that Megill can be a quality starting pitcher, and maybe this was just the runway he needed, and he'll get some starts to begin the year. And when Manaea is good to go, it's one of the other guys that get squeezed out of this rotation. I honestly do feel pretty good about him. Not great to say that he's going to be a number 3 starter. I'm not necessarily saying that, but can he pitch to a low 4s potentially and eat up a bunch of innings and strike out some batters and have some dominant starts mixed in there? I do have some hope. Paul Blackburn's an interesting one because last year that acquisition came out of nowhere. Comes to the Mets, first 2 starts, quality starts, 6 innings pitched, 1 earned run each start, 6 strikeouts, 2 walks, identical lines across the board. Third start comes against his former team, the A's, and he gets absolutely rocked, gives up 6 runs. Fourth start, he's right back there with a quality outing, 6 innings pitched, 1 run allowed. Final start of the year, facing off against the Padres, he gets beat up in more ways than one, gives up 5 runs on 10 hits, and takes a comebacker off his hand that basically cost him the rest of the season, although it ended up being the spinal injury that really ended the year for him. But still, when you look at the 5 starts that we saw of Paul Blackburn in the Mets uniform, there was 3 quality starts, 2 not so good starts. And I think that's the guy that he would be for the Mets this year. But as a 5th starter, that's not the worst thing. If you told me that 60% of the starts were good and he had a couple of clunkers mixed in, that's not bad for a 5th or a 6th starter. But if the pecking order moves and now he's your 4th starter, now you got some problems. Griffin Canning led the American League in earned runs allowed last year. He pitched to an ERA over 5. With that said, he threw over 170 innings, which is why he gave up so many runs, because he wasn't effective, but he was on the mound a ton. And the Mets bet on this guy, and they obviously value him. They clearly think that they can get more out of him than the Angels, and that's not a bad bet to make considering how bad the Angels have been at developing and finding pitching, but it's still a gamble. So I look at where the Mets are right now and I say, all right, fine. Maybe Manaea and Montas aren't out for the long haul, but this rotation is clearly the Achilles heel of this team. We just don't know how guarded they are against it. They tried to be guarded against that Achilles heel with plenty of depth. Now the depth is being tested. Beyond these guys that we're talking about, you have Justin Hagenman and Brandon Waddle, who have been thrown around as the next wave of starting pitching depth for the New York Mets. Hagenman is on the 40-man roster. Waddle was a non-roster invite. But those guys don't have established big league careers. They don't even have a ton of success in the minor leagues. So I can't just take it at face value that they're going to be some find. They might be. David Stearns is very good at this. He has been able to find starting pitching throughout his career, but you're losing a lot right now. And so I do really wonder if Quintana signs with another team on Wednesday or Tuesday or whatever it is this week where a deal is announced and it's not back to the Mets. Where do they go if another injury happens? I mean, I guess technically you roll with the 5-man rotation and you hope that whoever goes down, whether it's another, whether it's a Holmes, Peterson, or Senga injury, you hope that it's minor, and you'd hope that, Manaea is back on the short end. So maybe you can roll with the 5-man rotation until Manaea is good to go. But it's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts. And if Justin Hagenman is getting starts in April, when this is supposed to be your year with Juan Soto and Pete Alonso, huge free agent acquisitions to pair the two of them in your lineup. And, you are bringing back a team that went to the NLCS with the runner-up for the MVP and Mark Vientos ready to build off of a breakout. There's so much optimism in so many places for this team. But then you're going to roll out this rotation where it's potentially Senga, Peterson, Holmes, Canning, Blackburn, Megill. It doesn't look great. And then you say, all right, well, how about the pitching prospects? Can these guys save the day? Brandon Sproat obviously has the most upside. He's the Mets' top pitching prospect. We'll see if he can follow the Christian Scott model of last year where he can be up by May. There's a chance. He's the guy I bet on. Dom Hamill and Blade Tidwell really struggled last year in AAA. Tidwell has really good stuff, but he doesn't have great control. He pitched today, gave up a 3-run homer. Wasn't a bad outing because he did still flash some positive things. Fastball has a lot of life to it. Average 96 on that. He has, a hard slider that he talked about that I think was registered as a cutter by some of the pitch metric sites. But that flashes a really plus pitch. He has a sweeper. He has a two-seam and a changeup. He talked about what he struggled with last year, which he said he had too many pitches. He said he had as many as 9 different pitches he was trying to throw. Now he has found a 5-pitch arsenal that he plans to roll with. He talked about, dealing with the difference of a strike zone and the different approach of hitters in AAA. This is a guy that flew through AA last year, got the AAA and hit a huge wall. I still think Tidwell has enough upside that you shouldn't give up on him as a prospect, but I also wonder if his future ends up being as a high leverage reliever where you take that fastball instead of having it average at 96, he already is touching 99. So maybe out of the bullpen, he's sitting 98, 99, touching 100, 101, and he's able to find one breaking pitch that he can really throw a bunch of, whether it is that hard slider, whether it's the sweeper, maybe it's both. Now you're cooking with gas a little bit. So I think Tidwell has the floor of being a nasty reliever and the upside of figuring it out as a starting pitcher. Do I think that's going to all come together this year? I think he can come together as a reliever this year. I don't know if he's going to round out his arsenal and be ready to go up against the toughest of competition. I'm not optimistic there. I'm not really optimistic that Dom Hamill's going to figure it all out either. So I think you're in a position right now where your depth chart really is the 6 guys we're talking about that are still healthy. Manaea, Montas coming off injury, and then Brandon Sproat. Unless the Mets decide to stretch out Jose Budo or Max Kranick, which they haven't made that decision up to this point, that's what you got, which isn't horrible depth, but it's a lot worse than we thought it was going to be. And it does put the Mets in a position where you think at some point they have to acquire a starting pitcher. If they don't sign one now, it might be at the deadline. I don't think there is an ace out there on the trade market that's going to be able to be, acquired at this juncture that the Padres are comfortable rolling into the season with Dylan Cease. Sandy Alcantara is not going to be moved until the deadline. And there's, probably a couple other names you can talk about in the same light that will potentially get moved, but teams are going to wait and see what happens. So for the Mets right now, it's either sign Quintana, and if he signs to another team, the only other guy in the market that makes sense to me at all is Spencer Turnbull, who had a lot of success for the Phillies last year at the beginning of the season out of the rotation, ended up in the bullpen, didn't pitch as well in that role, but did have that multi-faceted role last season that he could replicate with the Mets. So that could make some sense. But I imagine that they don't think he really moves the needle enough to warrant signing him. And it does feel like they're going to just roll with what they got unless there is a Quintana signing in the works. And publicly, they're saying it's not happening. So the Mets are really stretched thin right now. But you know what? It's just up to those guys that they've signed or traded for to step up. It's at the Paul Blackburn and Griffin Canning to show why the Mets were so keen on acquiring them. And it's up to Tylor Megill to finally figure it out and establish himself as a clear-cut, no doubt about it, big league starter that isn't in that constant role of being shuttled up and down between AAA and the big leagues. Anyway, we're going to move on from the rotation for the final segment because the Mets did make a trade that I want to discuss. So we'll talk about that deal in just a minute. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off, if you want to bet on that fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting, whether I'm backing my team for that late-game rally or if I'm picking a player to hit a clutch 3, I never feel like I'm missing my chance. Plus, the app, super easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Stay up to date with all the latest in the world of sports when you check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Our next goal is to get to 13,000 subscribers by opening day. I appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. Now, the Mets made a trade on Monday, acquiring outfielder Alexander Canario from the Cubs for cash considerations. Now, Canario is 24 years old. He is out of options. The Cubs had to make room on the 40-man roster when they signed Justin Turner. Canario was the roster casualty, and the Mets end up swooping in and making a deal to acquire him. Now, let's talk about the player before we talk about the fit. Last year, he played 15 games with the Cubs and had good numbers. Hit 280, 357 on base, 440 slug, good for a 797 OPS. In 64 games in AAA, he hit 243, 336 on base, 514 slug, 18 home runs, and 850 OPS. You're talking about a right-handed hitter that packs some pop, could potentially play all three outfield positions, though he's not heralded for his glove. He's an interesting option. In the Dominican Winter League this year, he hit 304 with a 411 on base and a 544 slug. That's a 955 OPS. So, where does he fit the Mets roster? I know that some people see this move, they see the fact that he can't get optioned, and they think, wow, all right, the Mets are trading Starling Marte, huh? I wouldn't jump to that conclusion. If you look at the Mets 40 right now, they actually already have a guy on the roster that doesn't have options. That is Jose Azocar. Azocar has actually gotten off to a pretty good start, too. He is 2 for 5 with a homer. So he's been pretty good in early going and has gotten, decent amount of playing time. There's been 4 games played with 2 of them being in a split squad. But still, he's been starting in center field and he gives you another option. We haven't seen, if I'm not mistaken, Jose Siri. We might have seen Tyrone Taylor, but regardless, he does give you another right-handed option. So what does this mean? You have 2 guys that can't get option that are now all of a sudden on your 40-man roster. Remember last year when the Mets acquired Luis Torrens? If you remember at the time, the Mets were running out Tomas Nido and Omar Narvaez as their tandem of catchers when Francisco Alvarez went down. Narvaez broke camp with the team. Tomas Nido was on actually, he wasn't on the 40-man roster. He was in the organization. He had gotten DFA'd in 2023, never got claimed by anybody, stayed in the organization, but on major league salary, gets added, if I'm not mistaken. That's how it all ended up working out. So then it was Nido and Narvaez, and Nido was outplaying Narvaez to the point where it was like, man, Tomas Nido is finally realizing his potential of being the backup catcher of the future for the Mets that we had been promised for years. Alvarez was getting close to his return. Felt like the Mets had a really good catching situation. Well, then what happens? The Mets make a trade for Luis Torrens, and they cut bait on Narvaez early. And we all thought, man, that's weird. Why? Just to get marginally better for a series in Washington? Well, I was at that series in Washington. You might remember that was the beginning of the turnaround for the New York Mets as the calendar shifted to June. And Luis Torrens had a big impact. Then he went with the Mets to London, and he won a game for them with an unbelievable play at the plate, an unbelievable double play turned. Stay with the Mets, control the running game, and now he's still their backup catcher. They cut bait with Tomas Nido, who at the time was, I think, the longest tenured member of the organization. Cut bait with him, and it was Torrens. The reason why I bring up Luis Torrens to talk about these outfielders is the New York Mets are always looking to improve their roster. It's always about, let's make our roster as good as possible for today and tomorrow. And then when they have to adjust, they'll adjust. So the Mets saw a guy here that has a lot of talent. He's 24 years old. A potential steal. Why not bring him into camp and see what happens? Because guess what? If Starling Marte, who's 36 years old, is trying to leg out a double in spring training and he comes up lame, ends up on the IL, all of a sudden, guess what? You might be rostering this guy. If it doesn't work out and there's no spot for him because the Mets have too many outfielders, and they already do. They have Tyrone Taylor. They have Jose Siri. Neither of them has options. They have Marte and Winker on guaranteed big league contracts. They have Juan Soto and Brandon Nimmo, who obviously don't have any potential to be off this roster. They have a crowded mix. With that said, you never know what can happen. And worst case scenario, the end of camp, you try to pass him through waivers and another team claims him. That's it. So the Mets are making a gamble here that maybe they'll be able to pass him through waivers, and they're giving themselves some more depth. They're giving themselves more options. You hope that they don't need to exhaust that level of depth. And at the end of camp, you see if Azokar and Canario get through waivers. And if they do, all right, you got a couple options in Syracuse who could potentially make an impact at some point this season if injuries pop up. It's just smart roster construction, but it's not something to make too much out of at this point. It's just a minor trade that might not ever impact the big league roster. Now, one final note to close out the show today. I did mention Blade Tilwell already. He had, I wouldn't say a great start. He gave up 3 runs, but he did pitch 2 innings. The other player that I wrote down here for spring training notes is Pete Alonso. Pete Alonso is off to a great start. It's 5 plate appearances. We can't read too much into that, but 4 walks and an RBI double. So Pete Alonso is rocking a 3,000 OPS right now. He has not gotten out in spring. Good to see him feeling comfortable in the box. I still expect a monster season out of Pete Alonso in 2025. But who is going to be pitching when Pete Alonso is playing first base? That's the big question that we're going to be monitoring throughout camp at this point. Did the Mets just sign Jose Quintana? I guess we'll find out if the reports are true and he's off of that Team Colombia roster. So we'll see where Quintana lands. That'll be something we'll be talking about on tomorrow's show. We'll see if the Mets consider making any other moves or if they are rolling with their depth. And if they are, we'll certainly be watching with a very close eye as all these guys start to get on the mound throughout the Grapefruit League. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, find a link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listener, your first watch every day. Now, for your second watch, head over to YouTube and check out the first ever 24/7 streaming channel that covers everything in the world of sports. Of course, I'm talking about Locked On Sports Today with our local hosts from each team, league-wide hosts from each league. Find Locked On Sports Today streaming 24/7 on YouTube.